Okay, let's turn to Psalm number 40. Psalm 40. I'll read the first 10 verses, but we'll look this evening at verses 6 to 10. Let's read from verse 1 of Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of an horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my goings. And he hath put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto our God. Many shall see it and fear, and shall trust in the Lord. Blessed is that man that maketh the Lord his trust, and respecteth not the proud, nor such as turn aside to lies. Many, O Lord my God, are thy wonderful works which thou hast done, and thy thoughts which are to usward. They cannot be reckoned up in order unto thee. If I would declare and speak of them, they are more than can be numbered. Sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. Then said I, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. I have preached righteousness in the great congregation. Lo, I have not refrained my lips, O Lord, thou knowest. I have not hid thy righteousness within my heart. I have declared thy faithfulness and thy salvation. I have not concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation. The Psalms, in one sense, without detracting from their original intention, can be said to be messianic. That's all of the Psalms speak in one form or other of our Saviour, Jesus Christ. They were, of course, penned by original authors. Half of the Psalter was penned by the second king of Israel, David. We know of 73 of them that are ascribed to David in the Psalter, and then there are 2 others that are in the New Testament ascribed to David, so we know 75 of the Psalms came from the hand of David. There were other authors and contributors to the Psalter, but even though they had an original context to them, experiences of the psalmist, nevertheless they all ultimately speak of Christ. And C.H. Spurgeon says of this psalm, here we enter upon one of the most wonderful passages in the whole of the Old Testament, a passage in which the incarnate Son of God is seen not through a glass darkly, but as it were, face to face. And what we have here is a reference, of course. The Old Testament fully understood all about sacrifices. And in verse 6, sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Well, under Old Testament sacrificial system, the Lord desired sacrifices and the offering up. And firstly, we want to notice the sufficient demand that's put here. The sacrificial system had been abolished. Old Testament sacrifices were never enough. Hebrews chapter 10 reminds us of that. It's not through the blood of bulls and goats can take away sins. They're all over the Old Testament. things like the book of Leviticus and other passages, sacrifices were a common feature. And we must never see those as being something that was permanent in God's plan of redemption. They were pictures of something far greater. It was also a demonstration that the Old Testament sacrificial system, no matter how pure and clean the animal was, would never be sufficient to take away a person's sin. I mean, religions today still have some form of sacrificial system or something that would represent a sacrifice. But we don't have that. The gospel doesn't give us the need for a sacrificial system in which to take away sins, because no amount of sacrifice, and that includes our sacrificial giving and all the rest, can take away sin. So these Old Testament laws of sacrifice and that which was associated with the sacrificial system, we can say has been done away with. We mentioned the other week about the dietary laws that are mentioned, and the world often points the finger at the church and says, well, you people are inconsistent, you eat shellfish and all the rest, you don't keep the dietary laws. Well, of course, we were not Jews, so they were never given to us in the first place. And secondly, they were abolished. And Acts chapter 10 tells us, what God hath cleansed, call not that thou common. And Peter said, nothing unclean has entered my mouth. Well, God said, God has cleansed it. There's no such thing as anything that will be sacrificially unclean. These were pictures that were speaking of something that was greater to come. He says, sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened, burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. Because the ultimate acceptance of God of the sinner is not based upon the sacrifice of an animal, because that had to be repeated. And one of the things we learned from the Day of Atonement is that had to be done every year. They couldn't say, well, we did it last year. Is that not sufficient? Well, the answer would be no, because last year's sacrifice was not sufficient to do that. But there is a sacrifice that God did accept and does accept, where it's only ever done once. And therefore, when it was done, it was satisfied. And God accepted it. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened or made alive by the Spirit. So the Old Testament Jews knew it wasn't sufficient. The New Testament Jews, the early church, the disciples, were Jews. All of the New Testament was written by Jews, maybe the exception of Luke. But other than that, and that's up for debate, it was a Jewish book with Jewish sacrifices, with Jewish ritual. But they came to realize these are now no longer needed, and the reason being God provided one sacrifice that was sufficient and fulfilled all other sacrifices there. Now, God does accept our acts of service to God, and that's important. In 1 Samuel 15, and there at verse 22, we have recorded for us these words. And Samuel said, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. You see there he's referring to Saul. And Saul, of course, wasn't a priest. Saul in the Old Testament was a king and a prophet, but he was not a priest. and therefore he should never have sought to offer sacrifices to God. So although he thought, well, I'm doing a good thing, I thought, the Lord is delaying and Samuel is delaying, and he went ahead and did it. Well, that never covered. It was obedience that the Lord wanted from Saul and not sacrifice. Nobody has ever held the three offices of prophet and priest and king. The only one who has ever held those three offices is Christ, who is prophet, priest and king. Well, Saul is seeking to take those three offices, prophet, priest and king. Well, only Christ can offer and is sufficient to offer that, not man himself. But we can offer our sacrifices, if you want to use that term, of praise and worship to God and of obedience. In verse 7, then said I, lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me. The seeing delight, the second point. All of the Old Testament spoke of the coming Saviour, who would deliver his people from their sins. So we can never have the luxury, if you want to call it that, of dropping the Old Testament and say, well, we're New Testament saints. The New Testament doesn't make sense unless we have the Old Testament. The New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. But the New Testament and all that it speaks of doesn't make sense without the Old Testament. That's why it's important to always be reading the Old Testament. Another reason was, Martin Lloyd-Jones said, one of the reasons for a lack of reverence in the church and of a godly fear is lack of preaching on the Old Testament. So we don't have two different gods. We don't have the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. Sometimes people speak like that. But there is no difference. And even Christians, I've heard, when people point out things about a God of wrath, they say that's the Old Testament, as if he's different in the New Testament. Of course, we need to realize that the God who struck down dead Ananias and Sapphira for merely telling a lie is the same God. The same Jesus who is gentle and mild and loving and forgiving. But he's the one who struck down those two who lied. But he speaks of a coming deliverer. In the book it is written of me. And the Old Testament is full of Christ. We know, of course, the first promise in the Bible is Genesis 3:15, and it was the prophecy of a coming Messiah. Now, we don't have the whole message of Scripture in one lump. It progressively grows in the Old Testament. You find it unfolding as we progress through the Old Testament. It's an unfolding redemptive plan. And God wrote in his book of Christ's coming. Luke 24 and verse 27. We've got Christ's own word of testimony concerning these things. We see this. Christ says to them in verse 26, ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all things, in all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. So in order to testify who he was, Christ expounded from the Old Testament to say, this speaks of me. And Israel was warned, wasn't she, not to take a king. She was to be different from all others, but she wanted to be like everybody else. One wonders, did she forget the glory of God and the wonders of her king? She must have been in a terrible backslidden state to have said, we want to be like everybody else. We want a king like all of the other nations. Well, God was their king. God was their king. And she shouldn't have wanted to be like all of the others. But God then gave them the desire of their heart and gave them a king. And we know the first king was King Saul. And what a mess he made of it. Saul started well, and he started humbly, but he went terribly wrong. Now, when they were to choose a king, they went to look to the world to provide their king. They were to look amongst their own tribes, amongst the 12 tribes of Israel, amongst the brethren. They went to seek a king from the Canaanites, or the Hittites, or the Amorites. They were to look amongst themselves. Now that's important to remember, because in Deuteronomy verse 17 gives the election and the duty of a king as to what they were to do. Now, if you have any understanding of Islam, they jump into chapter 18 and verse 18 and say that's their prophet. But if you read Deuteronomy 17 and Deuteronomy 18, you think that's not what the passage is speaking about at all. It's not about someone who would come from the tribe of Ishmael or from the lineage of Ishmael. You see, when thou art come unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are about me. That's Deuteronomy 17 verse 14. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. In other words, the king that they would choose had to be from among their own tribes. So that's the context of Deuteronomy 18. He had to be a fellow Jew. And then, of course, when we come to verse 18, I will raise up to them a prophet from among their brethren, a fellow Israelite. The Islam religion say, no, that's Muhammad. But it's not. Muhammad wasn't a Jew. Muhammad wasn't from one of the tribes of Israel. But Deuteronomy 18:18, thou shalt rise up a prophet from among thy brethren unto thee. I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. That's a prophetic statement of Christ. Christ is the one here spoken of who will come. And Peter makes mention of that, fulfilling that fulfillment. I just throw that in as a little bit because Islam twists that text and says this is our prophet. It's nothing of the sort. He wasn't from any of the tribes of Israel. But that prophet that would come is the one that the Psalms speak about, which is Jesus Christ, who would come as a Saviour. I delight to do thy will, in verse 8, O my God, yea, thy law is within my heart. Now, the law of God. Here is, we could say, Christ's active obedience. The theologians speak of Christ's active obedience and his passive obedience. His active obedience is his performing the works of the law. You know, even while Christ was put on trial, they couldn't find any fault with him. He kept the law perfectly. He fulfilled the law to absolute perfection. If in the Old Testament, any sacrifices had to be without blemish. If it had a scabby eye or a torn skin, like in the days of Malachi, they didn't offer the best, which they should have done. They offered anything. But it had to be without blemish because it's symbolizing a perfect sacrifice. Well, Christ's active obedience, he was without blemish. If he had any sin on him, then it wouldn't be a perfect sacrifice. So Christ kept the whole of God's law, fulfilled it perfectly, and therefore he could say, I delight to do thy will, O my God. Thy law is within my heart. He fulfilled all of God's requirements in his active obedience. He was without sin. Then there's his passive obedience that they also speak of, which is Christ going to the cross and being offered up as a sacrifice for our sins. Christ didn't merely obey outwardly, but from the very heart, because all of us have a sinful heart. You know, even if people could keep certain laws without blemish and say, I've never killed anybody, or I've never committed adultery, or I've never stole from anybody, but that's not it, because they're only the outward conformity of, well, I've never done this. But we've all committed those sins in the heart. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, although many of the Pharisees could say, we never committed adultery, we've never blasphemed, we've never murdered anybody, we've never stolen from our neighbour, but you'll always notice that Christ takes it to their heart. You know, but you've thought these things. He says, from within, out of the heart of man, proceed evil thoughts. That's why Christ said about them, you are like whited sepulchres or whited gravestones. They all look beautiful on the outward, but inside they're full of dead men's bones. And Christ saying that's just like you religious people, because the problem is man's heart. And that's where the problem is in society. You know, the Christian should never ask, well, why did Joe Bloggs kill so-and-so, or why did so-and-so do this? We know why they've done it. We've got a sinful heart. And that's why no sin is beyond any human being's reach or capacity to commit. Every sin. Even the well-known psychologist Jordan Peterson, he were talking about, I don't know whether he is a Christian yet, but he certainly has high regard for the Bible. But he were telling people about the case where people's neighbours were taken out into a wood and they were all shot cold blank. But in a previous life, these were policemen, postal workers, farmers, factory workers, just ordinary day-to-day people. But they were conditioned. And he says to the audience, you know, if you think you couldn't be someone who just would do exactly the same, you don't know yourself. Because it's in everybody. It's in everybody. The only one who didn't have that capacity was the pure, spotless Lamb of God. You know, John the Baptist says, behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. And that lamb was perfect. You know, it's no coincidence, is it? In the Old Testament, the sacrificial system so often by the lambs that were slain. And Christ comes and he's pictured as the Lamb of God. It's clearly one's the fulfillment of the other. And Christ is pure and spotless. And he delighted to do God's will. The keeping of God's law, of course, for all of God's people, should be a delight. You know, Psalm 8 says, or verse 8, I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. You know, some people say, well, we're not under the law, we're under grace. Well, they misunderstand what Scripture's teaching there. We've never been under the law to bring us to heaven. The law is like a schoolmaster, as Paul says in Galatians, to bring us to Christ. It shows us we can't keep the law. It damns us. But when we become a Christian, Christ has kept the law, but our guide and our rule for living is the moral law that we find in the Old Testament. When Paul in Romans, he lists all different sins, and he's referring to the Decalogue. And if there be any other commandment, he says, in other words, I think he only quotes, 5 of the 10 commandments. They're a rule and a guide for the Christian. But we don't keep them because they're a burden to us. Without Christ, they'd be a judge to us. But with Christ, who's taken the penalties of the law, they become a pure way to obey and to serve the Lord. John says his commandments are not grievous. They're not burdensome. And that's lived out in Christian testimony, where people say the things I used to do and I used to love, but now I hate them. I don't want to do them anymore. You've heard lots of people, I'm sure, speak about that. I don't want to do those things anymore that I used to do. Why? Because you've got a new heart. And the things you once delighted in, you no longer delight in. And the things you once thought were prudes and old-fashioned, you want to do those things now. Because God's law is a delight to us, and we want to do those things. In verse 9 he says, I have preached righteousness in the great congregation. Lo, I have not refrained my lips. O Lord, thou knowest. When Christ came, he wasn't silent. And God's truth is not a mystery. God has spoken, of course, more clearly in the New Testament, because it connects with the Old, and its fulfillment is seen, and we can see how these have fulfilled the Scriptures. And we've got further revelation that speaks about it. But when Christ came, he was sentenced, wasn't he? Because of the things he said. Because of the things he said. I am the light of the world. Well, that was an offence. The only one who's the light of the world is God. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Well, the only one who is the truth and the way and the life is God himself. We're not life or truth, but Christ was. And he was judged and condemned because of the things that he said and the things that he claimed. And John is the clearest gospel that shows us the deity and the claims of Christ. Christ says, for what do you judge me? Or what good work? And they say, for a good work we condemn thee not, but for blasphemy, because thou, being a man, makest thyself equal with God. So Christ spoke the things that the Father had said to him. And that's a challenge also for the Christian. There may be times when we are silent when we should have said something, when we should have spoken. Christ says, let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. How do we do that? Well, it's by the things we say. The old saying is, preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. Well, that's not true. Somebody told a story about someone who just lived a perfect life and thought they'd let their testimony show through their perfect example, to which somebody then inquires, oh, are you a Buddhist? Words are necessary. And Christ is condemned by his words and by the things that he said and the things that he taught. And he was not ashamed to speak these things. And what he preached was the gospel. He says here, I have not refrained my lips. And confession is made, isn't it? If thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So there's not refraining our lips. And Christ is one who's described as righteous. I have preached righteousness, he says in the great congregation. God's righteousness. And the one thing that we all lack in this world is righteousness. We don't have righteousness. And that's our great problem. And one of the great verses to learn is 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21. For he hath made him to be sin for us, who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. That really sums up, I suppose, if you wanted one particular verse that sums up the whole message of the gospel, it'd be 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21. For he hath made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. So our righteousness is not our own. And that was what great reformer Martin Luther discovered. He didn't have a righteousness that was his own. And none of us do. And one of the problems with empty religion is that it's trying to produce a righteousness that it can never produce. The most righteous thing in a man, says Isaiah, is as a filthy rag. So we've no righteousnesses at all. But Christ had a perfect righteousness. And when the Christian dies, when the Christian is saved, we are provided with a perfect righteousness that God himself has provided. So if the devil comes on your deathbed and tempts you, well, you're not good enough, look at the terrible things you do. All we need to do is to point to a righteousness that's not from within. God's provided a perfect righteousness for us. And that righteousness, well, God has to accept it because it's his own righteousness. In verse 10 he says, I have not hid thy righteousness within my heart. I have declared thy faithfulness and thy salvation. I have not concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation. The world says religion is personal, keep it to yourself. Well, no, Christ said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. That's why the Lord has left us here, to preach this gospel of righteousness. And that's what changed at the Protestant Reformation. It was a return to the Bible. God's revealed himself through the scriptures. And what changed Europe and the world was a rediscovering and a return to the Bible. That's why people like William Tyndale, who was burnt at the stake in 1536, 10 years after he produced his New Testament in 1526. People would be burnt for reading the Bible. But it's the Bible that gives life. And of course, we're putting aside the Bible now, and people don't want it in schools, don't want it in travel lodges or Premier Inns, don't want it in hospitals. The only time I spent some time in hospital, you could open up the locker and there'd be a blue Gideon's New Testament. Well, that's not there now. Don't want it. But God provided a salvation through the scriptures, and that destroyed the penalty for sin. It's for those who believe, for those who trust. I have not concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation. He preached it to everybody. Christ was there, wasn't he, in the synagogue, opening up the scriptures and preaching. And they were amazed. How has this man such knowledge, having never learned or been trained? Like these Pharisees and scribes. Well, he came to speak words and truth. And he came, of course, his name shall be called Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. And that's what it's all about. And, the world in all its ugliness and pain and suffering, it does cry out, where is God? And, it looks at the world and it sees all the bad things are happening. And it says, where is God? Well, the greater thing God has done hasn't at the moment stopped all the sin and evil, but he's delivering people from sin and evil and the consequences of sin and evil. Before God puts an end to all the misery that we find in our world, he's first of all had to deal with sin. He's had to put an end of sin and of the penalty of sin, because otherwise, if he hadn't done that, then there wouldn't be a future for the world. So before we can rejoice in new heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness, as Peter says, God had to deal with sin first of all. There could never have been the promise of a new heaven and a new earth until Christ came. So Christ had to come first and secure the righteousness through his own death. And then there's a glorious resurrection. And then the New Testament writers then can look forward to a future that's to come. But Christ, first of all, before taking away sin from our world and making a new heaven and a new earth where no sin is present and no tears are present, he first of all had to deal with the consequences of sin. The wages of sin is death. And he had to deal with that first. And that was dealt with by dying himself on the cross. So we can say the wages of sin is death. Christ has paid that. But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. And that's what every Christian has, something wonderful and glorious to look forward to. If we didn't have any future, then we'd just be like the foolish atheists who say, well, there's nothing, no meaning, no purpose in life, and when you die, you're dead. That's a message of doom and gloom. Sometimes Christian preachers are accused of that being a doom and gloom message. Well, it's only doom and gloom for those who reject the message of God's gift and God's saving grace. But we can find Christ in all of the scriptures. The sacrifice that he made was the one true sacrifice that was accepted. And because of that, we can look forward to a blessed heaven, the glorious earth, in and through God's perfect timing. We'll end this there on that note.